Hey guys, welcome to Unit 4. Unit 4 is on political geography and it's going to cover chapters 9, 10, and 11 in your AMSCO textbooks. So chapter 9 is called The Shape of the Political Map. This quote is from Ronald Reagan when he was president of the United States. He's talking to the Soviet leader and it says, General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate, Mr. Gorbachev. Open this gate and tear down this wall. Speaking about the Berlin Wall that was separating East and West Berlin. This chapter's essential question is what social, historical, and economic factors have influenced modern political maps at various scales? Empires and kingdoms were common in most of the world for the past 2,000 years. However, global forces, wars, and changing ideas about political power, economics, and self-rule have reshaped the world map over the last 400 years. The structure of the contemporary political map. People often use the words country, state, and nation to mean the same thing, but in fact they do not, and they definitely do not when it comes to AP Human Geography. So you really need to understand the difference between these terms. Country is the most general of these terms. It's often used to describe any political entity that is independent from the control of any other entity. State and nation have more precise meanings. Independent states as building blocks. Political units exist at various scales, which we've been talking about since Unit 1. We have country scales in the United States, then we have states, then we have counties, then we have cities. Other countries, what we call states here, are usually called provinces and territories. So this map is a map of what we call the United States, which is actually one single state. All right, this is one single state with 50 different subunits. And again, I want you guys to, from now on, think about the states that we call the states in the US more as provinces and territories, which is more what they're called throughout the rest of the world. So here is what we call the state of Louisiana. But again, I want you guys more to think of this as a province. In Louisiana, because of the French history, they actually don't call them counties. In Louisiana, they're known as parishes. So here you see the parish that includes the city of Lake Charles. So in the United States, a person resides in several political units at once, maybe a town or city, a county, a state, and finally in the country as a whole. So again, this can be confusing because we're so used to thinking of the word state as these political subunits here within the United States. But on the AP exam or on the test, when you guys see the word state, it's really referring more to what you think of as a country. So state means country in political geography. So in this Louisiana map, it's specifically talking about just one of the states. But again, all of these 50 states really just make up one actual political geography unit, one state. So in the area of international relations, a state is the largest political unit. It's the formal term for a country. So again, state means country. A state has to meet the following criteria. First, it has to have a defined boundary, meaning actual borders. Second, it has to contain a permanent population. So for example, Antarctica, which does have defined borders, is not a state because it does not contain a permanent population. A state also has to have sovereignty over its domestic and internal affairs, meaning it has to have its own control over those things. So a colony is not a state because it doesn't have control over its domestic and internal affairs. Also, a state is recognized by other states, and this is where the definition for state can get confusing for some places because not all countries agree on what is a state and what is not. And we're going to talk about some examples of this, but Taiwan is a great example of this. Taiwan fits the qualifications of a state in terms of all of the other things. It has control over its internal and foreign affairs. It has defined boundaries. It has quite a large permanent population. However, it's not recognized by all other states because China claims that Taiwan is just a renegade rebellious part of China. The United States officially recognizes 195 states based on this criteria, but the number can vary depending on which government or international organization is actually making that list. These four requirements are easily defined, but in the geopolitical arena, they can be difficult to recognize. Considering the complicated relationship between the People's Republic of China and the nearby island of Taiwan. Taiwan is this small island located off of the east coast of China and historically was part of China. In 1949, China ended a long civil war. The communist forces, led by Mao Zedong, won this Chinese Civil War and established their capital in Beijing. About 2 million supporters of the losing side, who were known as the Nationalists, and their leader, Chiang Kai-shek, retreated to the island of Taiwan. China was divided between these two governments, one on the mainland and one in Taiwan. They each considered itself China's legitimate ruler. The government on the mainland never gave up its claim on Taiwan, and Taiwan never declared official independence, claiming it was actually the rightful government of mainland China. Today, Beijing rules over more than 1 billion residents in mainland China. Taiwan rules about 24 million, but it manages its own affairs and has diplomatic relations with about 20 countries. Officially, the United States does not recognize Taiwan as a separate country. However, we do trade with them, and actually President Trump made pretty big news in 2017 when he took office, when he actually accepted a call from the president of Taiwan, which made China very angry because they felt like it was legitimizing the government of Taiwan. You may have seen this political cartoon before. This was created during the American Revolution, and these different parts of the snake have initials for various different colonies. And it basically says join or die, meaning join together and fight the British or you're not going to survive. It was drawn originally by Ben Franklin and first published in his Pennsylvania Gazette on May 9th, 1754. Each segment labeled with the initials of one of the American colonies. However, Georgia was omitted completely, even though Georgia was one of those colonies. It became a symbol of colonial freedom during the American Revolutionary War. So sovereignty is the power of a political unit to rule over its own affairs, and is the key principle in understanding how these units function. In order for a political unit to have legitimacy, it must have sovereignty. Sovereignty may be challenged on the global or local scale. China's claim that Taiwan is nothing more than a renegade province is a direct challenge to Taiwan's sovereignty. And since Taiwan is recognized by so few other states, it seems to be an effective challenge. And as China becomes more and more powerful, it becomes more and more clear that they are willing to do whatever it takes to make sure Taiwan is seen as part of China. Largely because of China's opposition, Taiwan is not a member of the UN. China is one of the 5 countries that holds a very special place on the UN Security Council. These are known as the UN Security Council permanent members, and they include China, Russia, France, the UK, and the US. So the case can be made that Taiwan does not fully meet the 3rd and 4th criteria listed above. While it does have defined boundaries and it does contain a permanent population and does mainly have sovereignty over domestic and internal affairs, it's not recognized by other states, and we are seeing its sovereignty challenged by mainland China. So the case can be made that Taiwan does not fully meet the 3rd and 4th criteria listed above. Moving on to types of political entities. Often the term nation is interchangeably used with country. However, the terms are not identical. In general, a nation is a group of people that share a common cultural heritage. They have beliefs and values that help to unite. So let's look at a specific case example from Rajasthan, India. It's located in northwestern India, so you can see it outlined here on this map. And you can see there's specific types of climate involved in this place that are also going to affect the culture here. They claim a particular space based on tradition as their homeland, so it is tied to a geographic area. All right, next up, Afghanistan. So a good way to remember where Afghanistan is on a map is if you look at it in relationship to neighboring Pakistan. Pakistan kind of looks like a seahorse, and Afghanistan kind of looks like a snail on that seahorse's back. Afghans desire to establish their own state or express self-determination in another way. Depending on how tightly one applies these standards, the number of nations ranges from a few hundred to several thousand. Many political entities combine aspects of nationhood and statehood. A singular nation of people who fulfill the qualifications of a state form what is known as a nation state. So a nation state is basically a country that only has one cultural group of people living in it. They share the same language, they share the same history, the same culture, the same religion, the same nationality. So it's one country where everybody is basically the same. That's what a nation state is. There are very few examples of nation states, and in fact, there's no perfect nation states in the world because there's been so much migration. However, among the best examples of nation states are Iceland, and the reason for Iceland being such a good example is because of its natural isolation. It being an island that's relatively far away from other people, and so they've stayed relatively isolated, meaning that almost everybody in Iceland is the same. So Icelanders make up 94% of the total population, which is only about 300,000 people. Scandinavian settlers founded Iceland on an island that had no indigenous population. So there was no people there before these Scandinavian settlers. Another example of a nation state, though again not a perfect nation state, is the island of Japan. Again, its geographic location is the reason why it has been able to remain somewhat of a nation state, because it is islands, and so it has prevented a lot of in and out migration. So Japan is actually a series of islands, as you can see here. But the Japanese account for 99% of the total population of its 128 million permanent residents. So almost everybody in Japan is Japanese. They speak Japanese. They have the same shared history, the same ethnicity, and most are the same religion, which is actually Buddhist and Shinto. So a strong national identity coupled with strict immigration policies, meaning they don't allow people to move to Japan, have maintained Japan as a nation state. So we said Japan and Iceland are good examples of nation states because they're cultural groups that also coincide with the boundaries of a state. However, there are many opposites. There are many nations, cultural groups of people who don't have their own states. And then there's also lots of states that have multiple different nations inside of them. A multinational state is a country that contains more than one nation. Most multinational states consist of one dominant nation that controls most of the political power. A really great example of this is the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom composes of 4 different parts. It has England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And each of those places is its own separate nation, meaning their own ethnic group, their own history. Scottish people are different than English people, are different than Welsh people, are different than Irish people. But they all live together in one country called the United Kingdom. And they do have some local autonomy in their own places. Numerous multinational states fit these criteria, including Canada. While the English language dominates the culture, about 25% of Canadians today still speak French primarily, and that's mainly going to be located in one specific province of Canada, which is Quebec, which at one time was a French colony. Again, most of those French speakers in Canada live in the province of Quebec. And actually, the national group of those French speakers is known as the Québécois. In an effort to prevent Quebec from demanding independence, the national government passed legislation making Canada officially a bilingual state and gave the province increased local autonomy in government and education. But even still, there are many Quebecois who would like to see Quebec secede from Canada and become its own country. Similarly, the Canadian government granted more autonomy over local affairs and natural resources to the Indigenous nations. As part of this effort, it created the territory of Nunavut in 1999. Nunavut is in the far north of Canada and comprises of most of the Arctic archipelago islands of Canada. Over 80% of the population consider themselves Inuit. A defined area within a state that has a high degree of self-government and freedom from its parent state is sometimes known as an autonomous region, and Nunavut would be a good example of this. Even though it is part of Canada officially, the Inuits that live there really have a lot of self-control over the region. The next autonomous region that we're going to talk about is officially part of Finland, but it's known as the Åland Islands. And this is a group of islands located between Finland and Sweden. So for this example, Åland is a group of these islands that are located in the Baltic Sea. It is officially part of Finland, but it actually lies closer to Sweden. And most residents are actually ethnically Swedish and speak the Swedish language. So a desire to join Sweden after World War I was submitted to the precursor of the UN, which was known as the League of Nations. The League ruled that Åland should remain part of Finland, but as a non-militarized, largely self-governing entity, which it still is today. So the Åland Islands, again, are officially part of Finland, but they have a lot of self-control, making it an autonomous region of Finland. Since the world consists of far more nations than states, many nations do not have a state of their own, although they often have a political organization. These cultural groups that have no independent political entity are called stateless nations. They're a cultural group of people who do not have their own state, aka country. Stateless nations seeking to become independent states include the Palestinians. Palestine is a portion of what is today Israel, and they do want their own states. They mainly live in two areas of Israel, which is known as the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. So this is where Israel is located on the map. And then you can see here in this map, the West Bank is the larger portion of where Palestinians live, and then the Gaza Strip here on the Mediterranean. Prior to the creation of the State of Israel in 1947, Palestine was the entire place, and it was a British colony. However, after the Holocaust and after the creation of the UN decided to create the country of Israel. Originally, they did plan a two-state solution. So you can see from the second map, the partition plan map, this was originally what the UN had proposed. So there would be two countries, the country of Israel, which would be for the Jewish people, and the country of Palestine. And Palestinians are mainly Arab Muslims. However, right after Israel becomes a country, a war breaks out as all of the Arab countries surrounding Israel did not like this. And what ends up happening is Israel basically wins the war and takes over this area that was supposed to be Palestine. And so all of it becomes under the control of Israel, which is still where we are today. Now, the Palestinians do still mainly live in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and many of them still do want their own country, but they don't have it, which is why they are an example of a stateless nation. So this is a very complex situation because both sides, the Palestinians and the Israelis, feel like they have, and they do have, legitimate claim over this land. And so even though a lot of people look at this as a religious conflict between Jews and Muslims, it's really more about the land itself because they both claim it as their own homeland. So wars and fighting break out very commonly between Israelis and Palestinians, and most of the conflict is going to happen at the border of the West Bank and at the border of the Gaza Strip. Another example of a stateless nation that you need to know are the Basque. The Basque are an ethnic group. They have their own language, which is called Basque. And this nation is found in what is today northeastern Spain and southwestern France. So right along the Pyrenees Mountains and the Atlantic Ocean is where you're going to find this nation of people. So again, this is where the Basque are located. They are mainly found in Spain, but also parts of France as well. The Basque do want their own country and have had different time periods of trying to get that from both Spain and France. Spain has given them a lot of local autonomy to rule over themselves. So in some ways, you could say the Spanish portion of Basque country is an autonomous region because the country of Spain does give them a lot of self-governance. The largest stateless nation belongs to the Kurdish people. Kurdistan is a very large area that is located in several different countries. So it's roughly defined geocultural historical region wherein the Kurdish people form a predominant majority population. So you can see it spread among 6 states in Southwest Asia: Turkey, Armenia, Iraq, Iran, Azerbaijan, and Syria. And the Kurds number between 25 million and 30 million people in this area that they call Kurdistan. And what these Kurdish people want is their own country. And they are willing to fight for it. And in fact, the main ground force that fought back against ISIS in Syria and Iraq was the Kurds. And they weren't doing it to fight off the bad guys. They were doing it in hopes that fighting them off would gain them control over northern Iraq and Syria in the hopes that they'd be able to create their own country. Now, they've also been treated pretty terribly by certain groups, including Turkey. And as you can see, that's their largest area. So the majority of the Kurds actually live in Turkey, where Turkey views many of the Kurdish groups as terrorist groups for fighting for independence from them. So as states such as Syria and Iraq became destabilized in the 2000s, ethnic Kurds intensified their push for their own independent country. However, the Kurds still do not have their own country, and so again, they are the largest stateless nation, and we will continue to see them try to fight for control of Kurdistan. A multi-state nation occurs when a nation has a state of its own but stretches across borders of other states. Hungary in Eastern Europe is a good example of this. So you can see Hungary is located right here on the map. And the Hungarian people have their own language, their own culture, and most Hungarians do live in the country of Hungary, but many of them live in the Transylvanian region of Romania as well, making it a multi-state nation, a cultural group of people, Hungarians, who live in multiple different states, aka countries, being Hungary and Romania. Another great example of a multi-state nation is Korea. The Korean nation is divided primarily between 2 states: the Democratic People's Republics of Korea, which is known as North Korea, and the Republic of Korea, which is South Korea. The Korean people live in both of these countries, and they have the shared history, the same language, all of those things, but they've been split by this division of the 2 different states. The border between North and South Korea is known as the 38th parallel, which is the approximate line of latitude that divides the 2 countries. It's also known as the DMZ, or the Demilitarized Zone, which is kind of a misnomer because it's actually the most heavily militarized border in the entire world. Today's world map includes nations without states, nations in multiple states, and states containing multiple nations. I know this can get confusing, but again, you need to definitely understand all of these different concepts. This mixture of situations reflects the evolution of politics, economics, and warfare over the last roughly 600 years. The modern nation-state concept. For most of European history, no relation existed between the language people spoke and the state to which they belonged. For example, most people who paid allegiance to the King of France in the 1500s did not speak French. Rather, they spoke a regional language. And people who spoke various forms of Italian in the 1600s did not assume that they should be part of the same state. By the 1700s, the idea that people should live in nation states had caught hold in some areas, beginning in France and England. However, the map of Europe was still a patchwork of tiny states and a few large multi-ethnic empires. Europe in the 1800s saw an explosion of nationalism, or loyalty and devotion to a particular nationality. So again, nationalism is this loyalty and devotion to your particular cultural group. And so this is a quote from Albert Einstein, and he said, "Nationalism is an infantile disease. It is the measles of mankind." Now, if you remember, Albert Einstein was living during a time period where he saw two world wars, and one of the main causes of both World War I and World War II was nationalism. Here's another quote: "Race, religion, ethnic pride, and nationalism does nothing but teach you how to hate people that you've never met." Nationalism is fraught with dangers, of course, but so is the blind refusal to recognize that attachment to one's own culture, traditions, and history is a creative, normal, and healthy part of human experience. So this is just the other flip side to kind of nationalism being bad, but nationalism can also be good. On the one hand, groups rebelled against being part of large empires that were controlled by another culture. On the other hand, divided groups such as Germans and Italians wanted to consolidate into unified countries. Originally, the German Empire was trying to create that German nation state, taking over areas where people were ethnically German. The first German Reich was founded in 1871, and the German Empire consisted of 26 states, most of them ruled by noble families. Forces unifying and breaking apart countries. One definition of nationalism is a nation's desire to create and maintain a state of its own. Since nationalism unifies people, it is an example of what is called a centripetal force. Centripetal forces are forces that hold a state together. So some examples of centripetal forces that hold countries together are ethnic unity and tolerance, so being a nation state, social and economic equity, just and fair legal systems, charismatic leadership, religious acceptance, nationalism, common heritage, common language, and any other unifying force can be a centripetal force. So Richard Harstone, a leading political geographer, described centripetal forces as things that bind or hold a nation together. And again, this can be things like strong leadership or a charismatic leader. So this centripetal forces are not all sunshine and rainbows. It's not always necessarily a good thing. For example, Hitler was most definitely a centripetal force for Germans. He was something that brought Germans together. But it can be good things too, like education levels, movement, having a strong economic system. All of those things can be centripetal forces that help to hold a country together. A shared religion is a great example of a centripetal force. Like Roman Catholicism unites almost all Mexicans. External threats, having a common enemy, can also be a centripetal force. For example, Estonians are unified in their fear of Russia. Estonia is a country located in Eastern Europe. It's on the Baltic Sea and it was once part of the Soviet Union. So Estonians fear that Russia is trying to re-expand into those former Soviet territories. Another very good centripetal force is having a common language. So Japanese people share the same language, and that's going to be a unifying force inside Japan. The opposite of centripetal forces are centrifugal forces. These are forces that pull away from the center, or ones that tend to break apart states or keep one from forming. So let's look at the Western European country of Belgium. So Belgium is located between the Netherlands and France and is a prosperous country in Western Europe. The capital of Belgium is Brussels. And religion and language are a division between the people of Belgium. So there's actually a border between the two different major regions within Belgium. Most people in the north speak a Dutch language called Flemish and historically are Protestant, and their ethnic group is known as the Flemings, while people in the south speak French and tend to be Roman Catholic, and they're known as the Walloons. So there's two different nations of people living inside of Belgium. Imperialism and colonialism are related ideas, but they are not the same. Imperialism is a broader concept. It includes a variety of ways of influencing another country or group of people, either by direct conquest or by economic control or by cultural dominance. Colonialism is a specific type of imperialism in which people actually move into and settle on the land of another country or peoples. Examples of imperialism and colonialism can be found throughout history and all over the world, but modern European imperialism and colonialism are the most relevant to current political maps. They occurred in two distinct waves. The first wave of European colonialism was led by Spain and Portugal, and then by France and Britain. These countries established large empires in the Americas, and they were motivated by what we call God, gold, and glory. When we say gold, we're not just talking about gold. They really wanted economic wealth from exploiting land, labor, and capital to enrich the home country. So they would take the wealth of these new lands, and that wealth would be sent back to the actual country. When we say God, we're talking about religious influence by spreading their particular form of Christianity. For Spain, Portugal, and France, that's going to be Roman Catholicism. For the British, it's going to be Protestant Christianity. And when we say glory, we really are talking about political power by expanding their influence throughout the world, which was also a part of the competition between the European powers. So if Spain took a new colony, well, then France felt like they had to take another colony as well to keep their powers equal. The European powers justified their conquest through the legal concept of terra nullius, a Latin phrase meaning land belonging to no one. According to this concept, they could legitimately seize uncivilized land, as they called it. The result was the dispossession of indigenous people, some of which had incredibly complex and very high-tech empires, including the Aztecs when the Spanish arrived. The impact of this concept is still being readdressed throughout parts of the world today. Wars among empires influence colonial claims. In the 7 Years' War, known here in North America as the French and Indian War, the British won control of Canada from France. However, the strain of paying for the war led to conflicts between Britain and its colonies, soon resulting in the American Revolution. US independence really happened early on in terms of European colonialism. A lot of students want to think that after we gained our independence here in the US, that was kind of the end of colonialism for the British, but really it was just the beginning. England went on to take colonies all over the rest of the world, even after we had gained our independence. But our independence inspired similar movements in other colonies. Let's quickly look at the country of Haiti, which encompasses the left half of the island of Hispaniola. The right half is the country of the Dominican Republic. This island originally was split between French, which is what Haiti is today, and the Dominican Republic, which was a Spanish colony. The Haitian Revolution created the second independent country in the Americas after the United States. But what was different about Haiti was their revolution was led by slaves. So the French had mainly used Haiti as a place to grow sugarcane and brought lots of slaves from Africa. And those descendants of those African slaves rose up against the French and were able to successfully gain their freedom through the Haitian Revolution. Next, let's talk about Cuba, which was a Spanish colony. So by 1833, most of Latin America was free from European rule, and nationalism was spreading through the region. During the 19th century, the Spanish and the Portuguese empires declined, but other European countries launched a second wave of colonization. Led by Great Britain, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, and Germany, this wave focused on controlling lands in Africa and Asia. What's going to be different about Africa and Asia, though, is you're not going to have as many people from Europe moving to those places. So this is a better example of imperialism rather than colonialism. In the Americas, they were true colonies because people from those European countries actually moved to the Americas and settled there. Besides South Africa, that was not going to be true for the rest of the European colonies in Africa. In 1884 and 1885, representatives from the major empires of Europe met in the German capital of Berlin to lay out claims made on the continent of Africa. The Berlin Conference, or sometimes known as the Congo Conference, used these claims to form state boundaries in Africa. So basically what happens here is instead of the Europeans fighting each other for different parts of Africa, they all sat down in this room in Berlin and decided to just draw up a map and say who gets which piece of Africa. And that is what the Berlin Conference was. The Europeans didn't care at all to look at anything on the ground in Africa in terms of the people living in Africa. These boundaries showed little regard to the existing ethno-linguistic, cultural, and political boundaries that were already in place. As a result of the Europeans not looking at any of the cultural things on the ground, one colony may include a patchwork of rival cultural groups. And you can see the map from the Berlin Conference here on the left, and it may look familiar because many of these former colonies still use these as the boundaries for modern countries. So you may have asked yourself before, why do the countries in Africa have so many problems? Why do they have civil wars? Well, the main reason is because those boundaries were drawn by Europeans who did not care at all about what was actually happening on the ground. And one cultural group might be divided among multiple colonies. Geopolitical forces influencing today's map. While the European colonies in Africa and Asia did not last long, their legacy was strong. It can be seen in contemporary maps and the links between countries. People in colonies wanted economic control over natural resources like petroleum, precious metals, and so on. Free elections and changes in society such as racial equality and religious freedom. The United Nations, which was created in 1945 right after World War II, supported the demands of subject people in colonies for self-determination. Within a century of the Berlin Conference, after World War II, almost all European colonial territories had won independence, a process known as decolonialization. And the reason why this took place after World War II was basically because World War II was mainly fought in Europe, and those European countries could no longer afford to hold on to their colonies anymore because they had lost a lot of their power fighting each other in World War II. Many colonies gained independence politically, but not economically, and this is still true today. For example, the country in West Africa known as the Ivory Coast is the leading grower of cacao, which is what we make chocolate out of. However, the countries that benefit from that chocolate are going to be countries like France and Switzerland today, not the Ivory Coast. Transnational corporations based in the former colonial powers continued to control the extraction of natural resources through mining and the cultivation of coffee, cacao, bananas, and other crops on plantations. Again, most of the cacao that makes our chocolate is owned by countries like companies like Nestle, which is based out of France. Some of the poorest countries in Africa, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, are actually some of the most resource-rich countries in the entire world. It's just that those former European powers are the ones who are making the money off of those natural resources. What we see with this today is really what we call neo-colonialism. This emerged in the control over developing countries was exerted through indirect means, whether economic, political, or even cultural power. Civil wars in the developing world. From 1960 through 1970, 32 colonial territories in Africa gained independence. However, since independence was won by colonies rather than by cultural groups, the boundaries imposed by Europe remained in the newly independent states. As a result, cultural boundaries and political boundaries did not and do not match in Africa today. Cultural conflicts within countries have led to many civil wars. Then, because cultural groups spanned political borders, conflicts in one country often spilled over into other countries. One example of this is the very small East African country of Rwanda. Among the worst of the wars in sub-Saharan Africa was in Rwanda in 1994, which led to a genocide. Before colonization by Belgium, two rival ethnic groups lived in the area, the Hutu and the Tutsis, and they had competed for control of the territory and resources. In 1961, Rwanda won independence from Belgium. The Hutu majority won elections to govern the country, but the rival with the Tutsis continued. In April of 1994, the Rwandan president, who was a Hutu, died when his plane was shot down. Although no one knew who was responsible, this sparked Hutus' revenge by killing Tutsis and moderate Hutus on a vast scale. So the Hutus tried to exterminate all of the Tutsis, which is why this is an example of a genocide. This type of mass organized killing in which people are targeted because of their race, religion, ethnicity, or nationality is called genocide. One of the most horrific things about the Rwandan genocide was the way that these almost million people were killed, and that was via machetes, which are large sword-like knives. Within just a few months, close to 1 million Rwandans were killed, with many more migrating as refugees to neighboring countries. This pattern of independence, followed by civil wars and regional conflicts, is nothing new to the political landscape. And if you look at US history, you'll see that was even true for us. So basic facts about the Rwandan genocide was it started April 6, 1994. It lasted for 3 months. At least 800,000 people died in those 3 months. Most were Hutus killing the Tutsis. Again, that's why it's a genocide, because one group was targeting another group. It ended with the RF capture of the Hutu leadership. Serious problems result when national and ethnic groups are forced to share political space because of boundaries drawn by outside powers. As in many cases, one ethnicity may be spread over several states, so a conflict in one state quickly escalates into a regional one. Today, many of the geopolitical hotspots in Africa and the Middle East are difficult to solve because of borders established a long time ago. Moving on now to the Cold War. The Cold War was a period of diplomatic, political, and military rivalry between the United States and the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republic, known as the USSR, or the Soviet Union. The Cold War started right after World War II, so that's 1945, and continued through the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and ended with the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. Although the United States and the Soviet Union did not fight a direct war against each other, they fought several proxy wars, which means that they fought through other countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. For the United States, the largest of these Cold War conflicts were in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. The superpowers wanted to extend their sphere of influence, which was the areas over which they had some degree of control. This meant winning allies in other countries and thwarting their rival from doing so. The front line for the Cold War was in Europe. This was where East and West met each other, meaning the Western European countries, which were aligned with the United States, and the Eastern European countries, which were aligned with the Soviet Union. And this border between these countries, Winston Churchill coined the Iron Curtain. After the defeat of Nazi Germany, a tenuous peace divided Europe between East and West. The Eastern European countries liberated and occupied by the Soviet Army became Soviet satellite states. A satellite state is a state that's dominated by another state politically and economically. Attempts by Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968 to break away from Soviet domination were put down with overwhelming force. Germany's status was the most complicated. In 1945, after Germany lost World War II, it was divided into 4 zones of occupation among the victorious powers, the United States, the UK, France, and the Soviet Union. The first 3 of these zones united to form the Federal Republic of Germany, which was known as West Germany, which allied with the United States. The Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic and allied itself with the Soviet Union. The split in the country was repeated on a smaller scale in the city of Berlin. The city itself was located inside the Soviet zone, but it was divided into 4 parts. The Soviet part became East Berlin. But the other 3 parts merged into what's going to be called West Berlin, which was part of West Germany, even though it was surrounded by East Germany. In the late 1980s, new leadership in the Soviet Union began to relax its grip over its satellite states in Eastern Europe. Finally, in November of 1989, citizens of both Germanys brought down the wall that had divided the city of Berlin since 1961. In fact, within the next year and a half, Germany had reunited and former satellite states of Eastern Europe were holding free elections without influence from the Soviet Union. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, the Soviet Union, a confederation of 15 republics, began to collapse as well. Eventually, these 15 republics would become independent countries. After 1990, the political boundaries were once again altered. The collapse of communism and the Soviet Union created an enormous power vacuum, not only in Europe, but also throughout the world. Most of Europe made a peaceful transition into the post-communist world. For example, in 1993, Czechoslovakia smoothly divided into the Czech Republic and the Republic of Slovakia, an event known as the Velvet Divorce. Known as the Velvet Divorce because this country was able to break up into 2 countries without very much fighting. So again, this used to be Czechoslovakia, and today it's broken up into 2 different countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. However, the breakup of Yugoslavia, which is another country that was located in Eastern Europe, you can see it's right above Greece and right across the sea from Italy. But this country was much more complicated and much more violent in its breakup in the 1990s. There was long-standing ethnic tensions between the various different ethnic groups who lived in Yugoslavia. Hundreds of thousands died in clashes between those different ethnic groups, the Serbs, Bosnian, and others, before a handful of independent countries emerged. Many people died because of ethnic cleansing, the forced removal of a minority ethnic group from a territory. For example, one of the first countries that was created out of the former Yugoslavia was the country of Croatia. But there wasn't all Croatians in this area that becomes Croatia. There was Serbs. And so the Croatians pushed those Serbs out, whether it was by killing them or whether it was by just forcing them to move. That is both ethnic cleansing. The collapse of communism and the Soviet Union drastically changed the balance of power in Europe and throughout the world. Some former communist countries in Eastern Europe, as well as some of the independent states, joined the European Union and NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was originally a military organization to combat the power of the Soviet Union. So those NATO countries were the countries who are aligned with the United States, and that's why it stands for North Atlantic. So the US, Canada, and most of those Western European countries were the original members of NATO. And the purpose of NATO, again, is a military organization. It basically said that if the Soviet Union invaded France, all of those countries part of NATO would come and fight against the Soviet Union for France. So the Western Military Alliance was formed in 1949, again, to oppose Soviet military power in Europe. The balance of economic, political, and military power tilted towards Western Europe and the United States. So this is the timeline for these various countries and their membership into NATO. So the blue countries were the original countries, and then you can see after the fall of the Soviet Union, many of these former Soviet countries also joined NATO. And so you may think, well, why? What's the point of NATO today? The Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. But you got to think about a country like Estonia. NATO is the only thing that is preventing Russia from invading Estonia today, because Russia knows that if they invade Estonia, all of these other countries, plus the United States and Canada, are going to come to the back of Estonia. That's the whole power of NATO. So this shift frightened the Russians. They reacted by intervening militarily to support pro-Russian groups in the Republic of Georgia in 2008, and then also in Ukraine in 2014, taking over part of Ukraine known as the Crimean Peninsula. And actually today they are still fighting to have control over many parts of eastern Ukraine. So Russia is still fighting to take over parts of Ukraine. And Ukraine is not part of NATO. If they were, they probably would not have been invaded by Russia, because Russia would have known all of these other countries would have gotten involved if they had been. So that concludes it for chapter 9. In chapter 10, we're going to learn a lot more about this kind of stuff in terms of boundaries and different types of boundaries and all of that fun stuff. So thank you guys for paying attention, and have a good day.